In this lesson we're going to look at the ambient occlusion shader with render to texture. In 3ds Max 8, the ability to use render to texture with ambient occlusion has been introduced. Now we can export the ambient pass to game engines or other compositing sources. Open the file rendering ambient occlusion start.max. In this scene we have a bowl of apples, and we're going to use this shader on one of the apples so that we can see what this rendering to texture will do. Make sure in the render scene dialog that mental ray is your production renderer so that you can use the ambient occlusion shader. Select the apple bake object and bring up the material editor. You'll see that we have a white material, which is just a standard material with the ambient occlusion shader applied. We'll apply this to the apple. It will compute a map depending on what light hits the object. So it's similar to ray tracing in the fact that it looks at the rays of light, and if the light is occluded by another object, you get some shading on your object. So this is a real cheap way to get a pseudo global illumination feel. You see from this render that we have shadows kind of coming from our apple in the actual material of our object. What we're going to do is take this render and we're going to bake it into the texture. Open up render to texture by going to rendering, render to texture, and the apple, while being selected, is already put into render to texture. Scroll down to output and choose add, and we want to add the ambient occlusion pass. We'll scroll down a little bit more and set the size to 512, as well as set the same parameters for the shader in the render to texture dialog as we have in our material editor. So we'll change the spread to 0.75, the max distance to 20, and that's basically it. Once we've done this, we can just click on render, and once the render is complete, you'll see that we can see our texture baked in the scene. We'll just take a look at the material so that we can see what render to texture does. Sample the material, and you can see we have a shell material, and the original material is in the original material slot, and then we have another slot which has the baked texture, and if you drill down you'll see that render to texture has made a bitmap out of the ambient occlusion solution. Now it can be rendered just as a simple texture, which is very, very fast. So now you can use render to texture to be able to export these ambient occlusion maps outside of 3ds Max. This is a really valuable addition to 3ds Max 8.